basic as water rights in the western United States.
Utah? Reserves. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from California, Mr. Miller, who is a member of the Education and Workforce Committee and a former chair of the relevant committee having to do with the environment.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. I thank my colleagues who have spoken out against this legislation. This legislation is in no way a solution to the problems that we have in California with the continuing drought. This legislation is simply a legislative temper tantrum. They don't want to nuance what has to be nuanced. They don't want to have each area of origin be taken into consideration. They don't want to balance urban, rural. They don't want to balance agriculture, technology. This is what the governor's having to do. This is what the resource agency's having to do. This is what the entire state legislature is focusing on, trying to figure out how all of California survives a drought. This one just says what we'll do is we'll kick over the barn upstate there, we'll take their water, and we'll be okay. Well, why doesn't San Diego look up north and say, you know what, we'll kick over the barn, we'll take their water, and we'll be okay? This is the greatest intrusion into state water rights that we have seen in this legislature. And that's why governors of other western states understand the principles that are engaged here are an absolute attack on their states also. And that's why representatives from those states opposed this legislation last time it was presented, and they'll oppose it again this time. I yield the gentleman
an additional 30 seconds.
Gentleman's recognized for additional 30 seconds.
So you have a bipartisan coalition in the states trying to work this out from every economic sector, from every environmental sector, for the benefit of the state of California. This drought doesn't have to end in this rainy season. It can go on another year and another year. This legislation is destructive of our trying to make sure that every facet of the California society and its economy survive. And that's why this bill should be rejected. And it's an assault on fundamental states' rights that every other Western governor recognizes the moment this bill was introduced, and that's why they oppose it. They joined the governor of California, the Resource Agency of California, in opposition to this bill.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Utah reserves. Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday we gave the House an opportunity to consider flood insurance reform, which the Senate has already adopted. But unfortunately, it was denied. And as incongruous as it might be, we consider it such an important issue, while we're here talking about an equally important issue, drought, to bring up this measure having to do with flood insurance. It's an important issue for families across the nation, so today we will provide that opportunity again. If we defeat the previous question, I'm going to offer an amendment to this rule to bring up a bill that would delay flood insurance premium hikes and provide financial relief to thousands of American families, and specifically families in Florida. To discuss our proposal, I yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Nevada, my good friend, Mr. Horstman.
The gentleman from Nevada is recognized for 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman from Florida for yielding, and I urge my colleagues to vote no on the previous question and allow us to vote on legislation to address the nation's concerns about flood insurance and to come up with a comprehensive water plan to address our drought. Last month, the Senate voted overwhelmingly to approve the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act. And the headline of the American Banker article says it all. House GOP blocks vote on Senate-passed flood insurance bill. Florida Governor Scott urges Speaker Boehner to take up flood insurance fix by the Palm Beach Post. This bipartisan legislation provides a 4-year timeout on rate increases triggered by a property sale or a flood map update for a property with previously grandfathered rates. The bill also creates a flood insurance advocate to investigate homeowner complaints of rate quotes. During a recent trip back to my home state in Nevada, my constituents told me that these increases can be excessive and unfair. It's a problem that they want addressed now, and I urge my colleagues to vote no and to allow us to bring up this previous question.
The gentleman's time has expired.
Alternative.
The gentleman from Utah.
Before we go into a complete pivot to non-germane issues, I'd like to recognize 5 minutes to the gentleman from California to talk about how the first bill deals with water diversions, not water consumption.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 5 minutes.
I want to thank the chairman for allowing me to speak on this important bill. Today we're going to hear, Mr. Speaker, a lot of falsehoods. But we need to get to the bottom of why are we hearing those falsehoods. Because for 40 years in this body, people have made a career of using water as a weapon. Why? Because they never liked the fact that farmers and farm workers were making what was once a dry area of the state the Garden of Eden of this world. They never liked that. Why? Because they don't want to have to admit to themselves when they live in their beautiful cities of Hollywood and San Francisco and all these great cities that are on the coast of California, beautiful areas. It's a desert. They don't have any water either. So they wanted to keep our area, where I grew up, they wanted to keep it as a desert because they feel bad about the destruction that they've done on the coast of California. So if they can keep inland California in its original state, they'd be happy with that. But for the farmers and the farm workers that are losing their farms, farm workers are out of jobs. We're going to lose 30,000 jobs probably this year. It's an inconvenient truth that for 40 years this body has been preempting state law and taking water away from one region and dumping it and wasting it out to the ocean. You started with the Endangered Species Act, state preemption. 1992, a lot of talk about how we're gutting the Central Valley Project Improvement Act. That bill was a state preemption. We have no way to fix the problems in California because of all the state preemptions that have been done by the left in this body over 4 decades. So I found it fascinating, the members of Congress that were getting up to speak about how we're going to kill the fish and this water is so important for these fish and the little delta smelt, we got to keep them and keep the habitat. Well, there's a little more truth to that, Mr. Speaker. Let me tell you what they're really hiding. And I apologize for the viewers at home. This is what they're hiding. Sewer discharge into the delta, killing their precious little fish. Every one of the cities in the San Francisco Bay, Sacramento, the delta. Sewage runs right into the waterway, kills the little fish. It's pretty startling, isn't it? They don't talk about that, do they? The other little thing that they don't talk about is where does their water come from? Because they live in a desert too. People don't realize that. You go visit San Francisco, you visit Silicon Valley, people think that, oh, that's a beautiful area, you know, there looks green lawns, people water their lawns. They don't have any water, Mr. Speaker, either. Because conveniently, this body preempted state law, took water from our area in the Sierra Nevadas, which is about 200 miles away. But worse than that, they went into a national park to take the water. What national park? Yosemite National Park. They went to Yosemite, one of the treasures of our national park system, and they took this valley and they put a dam so that they could create this lake. Now look, I want the people of San Francisco and the Bay Area to have water. I don't want them to be like our communities and not have any water. But we have to tell the truth, Mr. Speaker. They dammed up this valley to create this water that then it doesn't go to the delta to protect their little fish that they care so much about. No, Mr. Speaker. It gets piped over to San Francisco. Here's the pipe. It runs, this is the Sierra Nevadas. They catch the water, they pipe it all over the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, San Francisco, discharge their sewer into the Bay, take pristine water from our area to feed their families, grow their grass. I don't see any of them up here saying that they're going to tear down this system, dump this water into the Bay to protect their stupid little fish. their little Delta smelt that they care about? We don't see that, Mr. Speaker, because they don't want to tell the truth. This isn't about truth-telling. This is about money and power. Millions of dollars. I asked for one additional minute. So all of the radical environmental groups that were created in this country started where? In that little epicenter, Hollywood and San Francisco on the west coast of California. Lawsuits. Lawsuit after lawsuit after lawsuit. Millions of dollars went to trial lawyers. But you know what, Mr. Speaker? Those millions of dollars that came from my community to pay off these rich lawyers, we don't know how many millions it was because it's hidden from the taxpayer. It's hidden from the American people, sealed by court order. Why don't they come out and tell us how much money they made? Millionaires off of government. Use the government to make millions. Use the government to dump sewer into the water to kill the fish. Dam up Yosemite to bring the water from Yosemite for fresh water, while our people, farmers and farm workers, lose their jobs. It's an inconvenient truth, Mr. Speaker, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased at this time to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Connecticut, my good friend, Mr. Courtney.
The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, anyone watching this debate I think understands why the American public is so turned off by this Congress. This is a bill which was brought to the floor in a hyper-partisan process, bypassing the committee, hyper-divisive, and it's going absolutely nowhere. In the meantime, we have an economy which needs this Congress to act. A few days ago, the Senate did act on a bipartisan basis to pass the Menendez-Isaacson Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act, which will help coastal properties that are now locking up because of skyrocketing flood insurance premiums, which the Senate bill will fix. Again, 182 co-sponsors in the House, bipartisan. We have the support of the Bankers Association, realtors, housing advocates, a broad consensus, broad bipartisan support. It will help the real estate market, which will drive this recovery in a positive direction. Let's act on that. Amend the rule. Let's bring up the flood insurance relief program and put this underlying bill back to committee where it belongs, where many of these thorny issues can be worked out by members who on both sides of the aisle and both sides of the state of California. Pass the flood insurance.
Gentlemen, an additional 30 seconds.
Additional 30 seconds.
Let's pass this flood insurance measure in southeastern Connecticut, coastal properties. Again, if you talk to the realtors, you talk to the bankers, these properties are locking up because of the increase in flood insurance premiums. We can change that today, right now. Get this bill to the President for signature. Let's get this recovery moving. Let's listen to the American people who want to see bipartisan action that is focused on the #1 issue facing this country, which is getting a strong economic recovery. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Utah.
If the Speaker would forgive me for trying to get this back on the subject matter of the bill in front of us, I wish to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from California to talk about the water bill.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 3 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, the opposition has erupted into a veritable Mount Vesuvius of misinformation on the California water bill, and I'd like to address a couple of the major points that they've raised. This does not preempt state water rights. It specifically invokes and protects state water rights against infringement by any bureaucracy, local, state, or federal. This is a legitimate constitutional function of the federal government that dates back to the 14th Amendment and is made essential by the unique relationship between the federal and state governments with respect to California water policy, the mixture of both the Central Valley Project and the State Water Project. To the ridiculous comment that this is a theft of Northern California water and that Northern California is united in its opposition, nothing could be further from the truth. On the contrary, this bill protects the North from any attempt to override established California water rights law in reallocating water from the North. And just to illustrate this, I would point out that it was these provisions in the last session of Congress that the Northern California Association of Water Agencies specifically pointed to in support. They said this: The bill, if enacted, now contains provisions that would not only protect the interests of senior water rights holders in the Sacramento Valley, but would also provide significant material water policy improvements to current federal law. The bill, if enacted, would provide an unprecedented federal statutory express recognition of and commitment to California's state water rights priority system and area of origin protections. And finally, to the argument that we cannot make it rain, there's not enough water to go around. Well, that's true. One of the reasons is because in this third year of drought, we have dumped a total of 1.6 million acre-feet of water into the Pacific Ocean that was desperately needed to support the threatened human population of California. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Florida.
Is he reserving?
Gentleman reserves. Gentleman from Florida.
Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased at this time to yield 1.5 minutes to the gentleman from Rhode Island, my good friend, Mr. Langevin.
The gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized for 1.5 minutes.
I thank the gentleman for yielding. Mr. Speaker, I rise to urge a no vote on the previous question so that we may immediately consider H.R. 3370, the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act. Mr. Speaker, communities in my home state simply cannot wait for relief from steep flood insurance rate increases. Rhode Island families have told me that they are facing flood insurance rates upwards of $35,000, and they are scared of losing their homes. If these rates fully go into effect, in many cases, families are going to be paying more for flood insurance than they are for their mortgage. And unless we act, it potentially could see whole neighborhoods, middle-class neighborhoods, wiped out because they drown not because of a flood, but because they're drowning under the weight of the debt of the cost of flood insurance. This is simply unconscionable. Implementing a delay in rate increases, Mr. Speaker, will give FEMA time to complete an affordability study and develop recommendations to help homeowners afford their premiums. Without it, thousands of middle-class homeowners will continue to suffer from the uncertainty of not knowing whether the cost of flood insurance will make home ownership unaffordable. This legislation passed the Senate Thursday with a strong bipartisan vote. The House companion has 182 bipartisan co-sponsors, and I urge my colleagues to support consideration of the Homeowner Flood Insurance Affordability Act and provide immediate relief for our families and our communities. I thank the gentleman. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah reserves. Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, would you be kind enough to tell both sides how much time remains?
The gentleman from Florida has 7 minutes. The gentleman from Utah has 17 3/4 minutes remaining.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. At this time, I'm very pleased to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentlewoman from California, who is the ranking member of the Committee on Financial Services. And I wish to make clear to my friend on the other side that continues to say that he wants to bring us back to the subject matter of this underlying bill, that the minority has been granted a motion to recommit, and that motion to recommit is just as relevant as the underlying bill. To speak to this issue, then, I yield 2 minutes to Ms.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. I thank the gentleman from Florida for allowing me to take some time today on this floor to plead with my colleagues on the opposite side of the aisle to join with us to support our middle-class citizens who now have their homes at risk. I plead with the opposite side of the aisle to join with what is a bipartisan piece of legislation, a bicameral piece of legislation, legislation that was passed out by the Senate that would correct the unintended consequences of the Bigger Waters Act. Why am I so passionate about this? First of all, I was a co-author of the Bigger Waters Act. It was a bill that we got together on when we tried to reduce the debt that we're confronted with, providing assistance and subsidies to our homeowners. Many of our homeowners, as you know, across this country are put at risk. Their homes are destroyed through natural disasters. We have to be available to them through this kind of insurance program, the National Flood Insurance Program. And so we have the Senate, we have Republicans, we have Democrats who have all joined in with us to do something very simple. Delay this for a time period. Delay this for 4 years so we can get on FEMA and FEMA can get it right. FEMA messed up the Bigger Waters bill. We said you have to do an affordability study. They did not do that. We said you have to get your mapping and your remapping right. They have not done that. We said get a credible database. They have not done that. We've got to correct FEMA. There's no reason why people should be having their premiums increased by 500%. This is wrong. We can do something about it. Don't stand in the way of coming to the assistance of the American citizens who depend on us in their time of trouble. Mr. Speaker and members, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from Utah.
May I inquire, my friend, how many more speakers he has on whatever topic he chooses?
2, I believe, and then myself ought to close.
I reserve.
The gentleman from Utah reserves. The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Garcia, who is a dear personal friend of mine, and he and I share concerns about Florida's issues as well as this nation as it pertains to flood insurance. Mr. Garcia.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. I'd like to thank my colleague from Florida for yielding, and I want to echo the words of the previous speaker. Like the gentleman, though, I urge my colleagues to vote no on the previous question so that we can take up a more important vote, so we can take up a strongly bipartisan Homeowners Flood Insurance Affordability Act. During this Congress, we have spent far, far too much time on issues that divide us, rather than on bipartisan issues that unite us. The Homeowners Flood Insurance Affordability Act is just that kind of bipartisan legislation that should be at the top of the House's agenda. It would relieve homeowners of crushing premium rates, that strengthen our housing market, and support economic recovery. That's why this legislation has such strong bipartisan support. The Senate passed this bill by a 67 to 32 margin. The House companion bill has 182 co-sponsors, including 56 Republicans. Mr. Speaker, if the gentleman will yield a little bit more time.
No, 15 seconds.
The gentleman is recognized for 15 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, this is not right. I ask my colleagues to join me in recognizing that by voting to take up the Homeowners Flood Insurance Affordability Act, it just can't wait. It's time to make a difference. For this reason, I urge my colleagues to defeat the previous question so we can take up this bipartisan
The gentleman's time has expired.
I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Utah. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I'm very pleased to yield 30 seconds to my good friend from Texas, Mr. Green.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized for 30 seconds.
Thank you very much. I will be brief, Mr. Speaker. There is great concern in the real estate community. It is very difficult to acquire flood insurance at some of the prices that are being quoted. I think it's exceedingly important that we adhere to the words of Ranking Member Waters. What's the rush? Why not get the study? Why not do that which we intended to do before we arrived at this position in our history? My hope is that we will heed her words. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah. The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Florida.
Mr. Speaker, I would advise my good friend from Utah that I'm the last speaker and I'm prepared to close. If he's prepared to close, he's probably delighted that I'm prepared to close.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm surprised that my friends across the aisle have failed to recognize the irony in bringing these bills together to the floor at the same time. The California water bill is an acknowledgement of how important clean water is, while the public lands bill undermines our ability to keep that water clean. It would be funny if it weren't absolutely the truth of the matter. Finally, Mr. Speaker, meteorologists are calling the high-pressure zone at the root of the drought in California the ridiculously resilient ridge. In that spirit, one could say that Republicans' resistance to extending unemployment insurance, fixing our aging infrastructure, raising the debt ceiling, fixing flood insurance, and passing comprehensive immigration reform is also a resilience worthy of the same adverb. I believe that it is time for Congress to get serious about moving our country forward. The motion to recommit is particularly relevant to all of us in this nation as it pertains to flood insurance, and this underlying bill, as Ms. Eshoo said earlier, is horrible. I ask unanimous consent, Mr. Speaker, to insert the text of the amendment in the record along with extraneous material immediately prior to the vote on the previous question.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Speaker, I urge my colleagues to vote no and defeat the previous question. I urge a no vote on the rule, and I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have appreciated the tone and the tenor of today's discussion and all the words that have been said on all the bills that are before us. We have the opportunity of making the desert bloom if we do things in the appropriate way. We have done it in the past. We can do it in the future. I recognize that most of the debate has been on the one bill in this particular issue, which deals with the concept of the concept. Does Miller want to speak? Jeff Miller's over there. Does he want to speak? All right. That deals with the issue of water in California. Totally ignored was the other issue that is equally significant, especially to the 10 states that have an interest in that, dealing with land policy. You see, there is a role for government. If government is efficient and effective and compassionate and uses common sense. And as I have worked with individuals both on the ground from the Forest Service and the BLM who live in the communities and know those people, they are usually fair, efficient, and effective people. They get it. But the further they ascend and are removed from the people and go up into the hierarchy of the administration as they tend towards Washington, D.C., it tends to forget people and the importance of helping people, and they become hamstrung as agencies with a blind obedience to policy and to regulation. So that the agencies become inefficient and ineffective, and they lack compassion, and they are certainly devoid of common sense. For example, we have one of the titles here that deals with islands off the coast of Florida. In 1946, given to those counties, but they were told as they were done that they cannot sell the land, they can only lease it, which means that homeowners and businesses on this island that had been federal property can now pay no property tax that helps the entire community to defend not only those areas but also keep the public lands open. It is an unfair situation. Now think of this. This is property the federal government does not own, they do not need, they do not use, and yet they still control by policy what they are doing on that land, which I'm sorry is a silly policy that simply hurts the people. We have the same thing across the country in Alaska, in Anchorage. 3 acres, 3 measly acres in the middle of a city surrounded by federal land. And you have to come to Congress because the rules and policy of the administration, the agencies, hurt people and lack common sense by denying Anchorage the ability to use that land efficiently as they wish. Once again, this is land the federal government does not own, they don't need, they don't use, but they still control what the local government can do with that particular piece of property. In Nevada, Fernley, Nevada, they are willing to pay the government just to leave them alone. All the land they want is within the city boundaries of Fernley. Once again, in this case, the federal government does not need this property, they don't use this property, they simply insist on controlling it, and what we need to do is simply to get them out of the way so we can help the community to move forward. It seems amazing that within many of our land agencies, we simply have a gridlock as we have a highly centralized bureaucracy that values power over the principle of actually helping people. If Congress has to be involved in moving 3 acres in the middle of one community, that is a preposterous situation in which we found. I recently read a book that dealt with my church members living in communist East Germany. Had a very difficult time in trying to find places in which they could build chapels so they could worship. If they found an area, they simply, a vacant space, they had to find equivalent private property to give to the state, because the state government in East Germany insisted there was no net loss of property by the state. What I find amazing is we in America with these land agencies have that exact same philosophy. There can be no net loss of property to the government. That means either we are wrong today or communist East Germany was correct back then, and I really don't think it is the latter. We have another piece of property in New Jersey. In 2007, the government came up with a management plan. It was agreed to by the community, not happily, but they agreed to it. They did a biological survey, and they found out that this plan does nothing to impede or harm any of the species available at Cape Hatteras. Yet the next year, there was a lawsuit. And the land agencies, instead of fighting for what they knew what was right and they had agreed to, caved in a sue and settle settlement, which harmed the people living in that area. It hurt those people who were making their livelihood after the tourism going to Cape Hatteras. Yes, in this case, the federal government owns the property and uses the property, but their control of the property is a total lack of common sense and a total lack of compassion and hurts the people who live there. During the Clinton administration, the Clinton administration identified land in the federal government control that was not needed, that was useless. However, trying to find what those lands are requires you to go to 150 different sites to look in 150 different books. Why would they not put that on a computerized system so that anyone can have access to it and there is transparency of what we do and do not have? And yet the agency simply says that even though that is a good idea, they are simply quite too busy to actually accomplish that task. And in a response that makes the rollout of Obamacare look well managed. Why do we need to understand where these lands are? I'll take a simple example. Forest Service had land in one of my communities that they had owned for 40 years and did not know they actually had. And when the community wanted to expand their cemetery and did a title search, we finally found out this actually was Forest Service land. Needless to say, even though the locals wanted this land transferred and they didn't need it and they hadn't used it in decades, it still took 4 years to try and get this Congress to actually authorize it to take place, and then the Forest Service still charged the community $6 grand to do the paperwork to transfer the land over. We have in the middle of one of our National Guard units BLM land that they don't need, they don't use, and yet we are still trying them to transfer the land over to the state of Utah so they can build needed infrastructure on a National Guard base that is still owned technically by the BLM. That's why we need to understand what this is. We have a simple system that we have bureaucratic lethargy in this country. We have a mountain lookout, a historical site in Washington that was historic before wilderness was created in that particular area, and to try and shore up that lookout so it doesn't collapse, they were then sued by an agency, and some judge back on the West Coast decided you have to send helicopters in there to tear it down because you couldn't actually make those kind of improvements in a wilderness area on a piece of property that is revered by that community, and they want to keep it in there. Even the environmental community uses that as the staging point for their hikes and trails in that area, but this was a decision that is silly, and we have to make that decision by this summer to save that historic site. In Yosemite National Park in California, a horrific fire that destroyed both public and private lands. We now look at the fact that most of the private lands are now 60% recovered. They have gone through to take out the dead wood, the dead timber. They are starting the reforestation process. But on the public side of that land, we are still going through an evaluation process that even under an expedited system simply means that it will be until late summer before they can actually finish that, and then the lawsuits get to start. Now look, if you don't remove that dead timber, that burned timber within a year, it is totally useless. And all it does is become infestated and becomes a source and a fuel for a future fire in a state that we've already heard is in their 3rd year of drought and desperately needs the water for other things rather than fighting a fire. These bills in this section of land try and solve these problems so we finally force the agencies to do that which helps people instead of hindering people's process. We find a situation where the agencies today of our government are inefficient and they are ineffective and they lack compassion that actually hurts constituents, hurts people, and they do not have common sense. And that's why this package is so important, and it is important to do it now to help people. It is simply sad that we are in a situation where Congress has to push the agencies to do the right thing. Should be better than that. We can do better than that, and that's what these bills attempt to do. Mr. Speaker, closing, I want to reiterate that this rule is fair, it is appropriate and as fair as are the underlying measures that are being presented to Congress in this rule. And with that, I yield back the balance of my time and move the previous question on the resolution.
The gentleman yields back. The question is on ordering the previous question on the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. Pursuant to Clause 9 of Rule 20, the chair will reduce to 5 minutes the minimum time for any electronic vote on the question of adoption of the resolution. This is a 15-minute vote.
So we have the House holding its first roll call votes of the day. Members have been debating the rule, the debate guidelines for two bills, the California Water Rights Bill and the Public Lands Bill. Coming up later today, we are expecting final passage votes on the Water Rights Bill and the Sportsman's Bill, which was debated yesterday, along with a couple of amendments. That Sportsman's Bill, promoting hunting and fishing on public lands, is expected to pass today, and it would allow people to carry firearms at Army Corps of Engineers created recreational areas. It would also limit the authority of the EPA to regulate ammunition and other hunting equipment. Further debate on the Water Rights Bill is anticipated today. That measure would alter water allocation procedures in the Central Valley of California to provide additional water for city and rural areas, including farms. General debate and amendments to the Public Lands Bill are likely tomorrow. So this first vote is on a procedural motion related to the debate rules for those first two bills I just mentioned. While this vote is underway, yesterday we spoke with a reporter who's been watching debate on the Sportsman's Bill, which is being voted on later.
The House begins debate on a package of bills dealing with hunting and fishing on federal lands, and we're joined by Phil Taylor, who's covering the issue for Environment and Energy Publishing. Phil Taylor, this bill is a package of a number of other hunting and fishing bills. Tell us what all's in here.
Well, it's a package of about 8 or 9 titles. The foundational title that has garnered the support of a lot of hunting and angling groups is Title 8 by Representative Dan Benishek. And at its core, it basically would amend the organic statutes of the BLM, the Bureau of Land Management, and the Forest Service to ensure that those land management agencies, which oversee hundreds of millions of acres of public lands in the United States, mostly in the West, it would ensure that those land managers would take into account hunting and fishing and target shooting opportunities as they put together their land management plans.
So the net effect of this bill is that it would expand hunting and fishing on those lands?
That's the intent. You know, there's some debate going on in the House right now about whether or not hunting and fishing opportunities are really being stifled on public lands. This legislation really is to provide some legal teeth for these agencies so they can defend the decisions to open lands to hunting and fishing if they're ever taken to court. And so there is some language in that bill that has garnered some opposition from backcountry hunters, for example. It involves protections for wilderness lands. By and large, that title in the bill is supported by most hunting and fishing organizations.
Early on in the debate, you tweeted about that. Will lead ammunition hamper passage of the Sportsman's Package this Congress? What are they proposing? What's proposed in this bill about lead ammunition?
Well, that title has hampered passage of similar sportsman's packages in the Senate. It basically says that the Toxic Substances Control Act does not apply to ammunition or fishing tackle. And that's been the impression of the U.S. EPA for years now. You know, some groups have significant concerns with the impacts of lead ammunition on birds, particularly the endangered California condor. as well as potential impacts to humans who consume wild game killed by lead ammunition. Now, again, a majority of sportsmen's groups don't believe there's a significant environmental or health concern here. The bill, the title would basically clarify that EPA does not have the authority to regulate lead ammunition. And the issue, though, is that in the Senate, some leading Democrats have taken a very strong stance against that title. When Senator John Tester in late 2012 tried to push a broader sportsman's package that had this same language in it, Senator Barbara Boxer and Senator Ben Cardin, raised vocal opposition to that. And it's one of the elements that probably hampered its ultimate passage.
On wild game, there's a provision in this bill, I understand, that deals with polar bear trophies from Canada. What would it do?
Basically, and I'm not familiar with the specifics of that title, but it essentially would give the Fish and Wildlife Service the authority to allow hunters who killed polar bears outside the country legally harvested polar bears would be allowed to import those into the United States. There are certain legal restrictions to doing so right now based on their endangered status under the Endangered Species Act. And again, this is a title that it's not opposed by many people. There's some wildlife advocacy groups that have raised concerns with it, but it has generated some controversy, no doubt.
In general, how's the White House view this sportsman's bill, this hunting and fishing bill that's coming up in the House?
Well, the White House issued a statement of policy last night opposing the bill. They do support some of the titles. Notably, they did say they don't oppose, they don't have any issue with the title involving the clarification of EPA's authority with respect to lead ammunition and fishing tackle. They did say they had concerns with, again, Title 8, the title by Congressman Benishek. They share the concerns of some conservation groups that there's some troubling language involving environmental reviews under the National Environmental Policy Act, as well as wilderness protections. But there was no veto threat. So the White House is not on board with this legislation, but they're not going to veto it.
Phil Taylor covers the Energy Department and the Forest Service and Interior Department for Energy and Environment and Energy Publishing, and you can follow his reporting on Twitter at Philip A. Taylor. Thank you for that update.
Thanks for having me.
And a vote on final passage of that bill coming up later today here in the House. Right now, members voting on a procedural motion related to the rule for general debate on the California Water Rights Measure and the Public Lands Bill. Debate on the Water Rights Bill is expected later today. Work on the Public Lands Bill may be pushed to tomorrow. The White House has issued a veto threat against the Water Rights Bill. Here's a portion of an administration statement on the measure. The administration strongly opposes H.R. 3964 because it would not alleviate the effects of California's current drought and would disrupt decades of work that supports building consensus, solutions, and settlements that equitably address some of California's most complex water challenges. California is experiencing severe drought conditions and low reservoir storage. The urgency and seriousness of the situation requires a balanced approach that promotes water reliability and ecosystem restoration. While voting continues here in the House, comments from earlier today from Congressional Budget Office Director Douglas Elmendorf on the nation's economic outlook.
I have a few questions about the health care law and how it's affecting the labor market. What is your best estimate of the effect that Obamacare will have on the total number of hours worked, which is the issue we're talking about? I just want to make sure we accurately understand what it is you're saying.
Right. So we think that the Affordable Care Act will reduce the total number of hours worked in the economy by between 1.5% and 2% between 2017 and 2024 relative to what would have happened in the absence of that act.
What is that in equivalent FTEs, full-time equivalent workers?
So given the fact that the calculation that we've done to translate that suggests that's equivalent to between 2 and 2.5 million reduction in full-time equivalent employment.
So just to make sure everybody understands this, and I think reading the report 2 million equivalent in 2017, 2.3 million equivalent in 2021, and 2.5 million equivalent in 2024, right?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
So just to understand this, it's not that employers are laying people off. It's that people aren't working in the workforce, aren't supplying labor to the equivalent of 2.5 million jobs in 2024, and as a result, that lower workforce participation rate, that less labor supplied, lowers economic growth.
Yes, that's right, Mr. Chairman.
So who are these workers? I mean, I know this is a statistical run, but who are the people typically in this category? What kind of worker from an income scale side are being affected by this?
So the effect is principally on the labor supply of lower wage workers. And the reason is that what the Affordable Care Act does is to provide subsidies focused on lower and lower middle income people to buy health insurance. And in order to encourage a sufficient number of people to buy an expensive product like health insurance, the subsidies are fairly large in dollar terms. Those subsidies are then withdrawn over time, withdrawn for people as their income rises.
Yeah, right.
And by providing heavily subsidized health insurance to people with very low income, and then withdrawing those subsidies as income rises, the Act creates a disincentive for people to work relative to what would have been the case in the absence of that Act. Now, these subsidies, of course, make those lower income people better off. This is an implicit tax, not the sort of tax we normally think about where if the government raises our taxes, we are worse off and face a disincentive to work more.
Yeah.
By providing a subsidy, people are better off, but they do have less of an incentive to work.
So
and
I understand
think they will respond to that by working.
I guess I
somewhat
understand
less.
the better off in the context of health care, but better off in inducing a person not to work who's on the low income scale, not to get on the ladder of life, to begin working, getting the dignity of work, getting more opportunities, rising their income, joining the middle class. This means fewer people will do that. That's why I'm troubled by this. Look, in your report, you note we're seeing a significant decline in labor force participation rate as the population ages. That's figure 2.8. And I'll just make a point here. This is what's so concerning about this is, if I understand your point, you know, a big part of this is something we already knew, which is boomers are retiring. So we're effectively basically doubling the amount of retirees we have in the country over a generation, and far fewer people are following them into the workforce. I think, just off the top of my head, it's something like a 100% increase in retirees and only like a 17% increase in the workers following them in. So that's already a problem, where we're not prepared for the boomers and their retirement. But what this is doing is it's adding insult to injury. You're saying because of government policies, as the welfare state expands, the incentive to work declines, meaning grow the government, you shrink the economy. Fewer people are going to be working, and the economy will be slower as a result. We have about $1 trillion in less revenue because of slower economic growth from your last forecast, which goes to the deficit, to the debt, and makes us that much less prepared to get ready for the baby boomers and to pay off this debt. So that, to me, is just jaw-dropping. If you look at this budget, I'm rounding here, Social Security and Medicare nearly double over the window, the 10-year window. Medicaid more than doubles, but interest on the debt quadruples. Is that about right?
In nominal dollars, yes.
Right. So your baseline shows us that adding about $10 trillion to the debt over the next 10 years, which is a 57% increase in the amount of the national debt. At the same time, interest payments, as I mentioned, quadruple to $880 billion by 2024. Here's what I'm really worried about. You assume fairly stable interest rates. You assume a normalization of basically no inflation on the horizon over the decade, and the 10-year goes to like 4.8 or 5% at the end of the window.
Yes, 5%.
We've got a $4 trillion expansion of our monetary base. We are in uncharted territory with respect to monetary policy in the Federal Reserve. They've just begun to normalize. We're already seeing reverberations in the third world and the emerging markets, and they've only tapered a little bit. What happens if interest rates don't go as we hope they do? What happens if we have a spike in interest rates, say, for instance, just 1%? What if interest rates are just 1% higher than what you're projecting to these interest payments?
So, as you know, Mr. Chairman, we try to set our forecast to be in the middle of a distribution of possible outcomes. We think interest rates could be higher than we project, and we think they could be lower than we project.
So give me a sense of 1%.
We offer in Appendix D of the report, as you know, Mr. Chairman, rules of thumb for how changes in economic conditions would affect the budget. And these are meant to be used only roughly. But this rough estimate is that an increase in interest rates being 1 percentage point higher than we project for the entire decade would increase the deficit by about $1.5 trillion over that period. And correspondingly, interest rates that were 1 percentage point lower than we project over the entire decade would reduce the deficit by about $1.5 trillion. And I would say, Mr. Chairman, that there is upward pressure on interest rates from a large amount of federal debt, and we take that on board in our projections. There is downward pressure on interest rates from the aging of the population. Economies with slower overall economic growth tend to have lower interest rates. We've taken that on board in our projections as well. And we do not see any sign of incipient inflation. Inflation over the past year has been unusually low, and inflation over the last half dozen years has been at or below the Federal Reserve's goal of 2%. So we do not see inflation as a substantial risk going forward, although like macroeconomists learn to never say never.
Right. Yeah, I mean, especially 10 years out, it's pretty hard to predict. Here's the issue. I think you could make a good case that the Federal Reserve has been basically bailing out fiscal policy for some time. Since the crisis, by keeping interest rates artificially low and depressing the true fiscal picture that we have. Unfortunately, Congress did not take advantage of that moment to lock in a real fiscal consolidation plan, a long-term debt reduction plan to tackle our entitlements, which is what our budget that we've passed 3 years in a row did. Balanced the budget, paid off the debt, dealt with the entitlements. Now the Federal Reserve is normalizing. Now they're basically pulling back. They're still very loose because they're, I think, what, $65 billion a month?
Yeah, right. So as they would say, they're still buying more assets.
They're still buying more assets. So they're still expanding, just not as fast as they were before, but they're showing signs of normalization. We've never been in this territory before. We've never had this kind of a balance sheet. It's all new. If they get it wrong, if unforeseen exogenous things happen, one point, it's a $1.5 trillion increase in deficits. So time is running out. We are looking at the fact that we squandered the opportunity in the last 5 years to do something about this. And in the future, it's that much more uncertain because monetary policy isn't going to be bailing us out like it used to be. That's my big concern. Let me ask you one point in relation to that about the driver of this. Figure 1-2 in your report, page 15 in your report. I think it's interesting. It compares where we were in 1974 to where we're going to be in 2024. We're on track to increase the deficit tenfold over the next decade compared to 74. Meanwhile, if you look at the upper right side of this, we will have cut defense in half. We're going to be collecting a full percentage point more of the economy in revenues. Given these facts, what is driving, just so people are clear, what is driving the tenfold increase in the deficit?
Is growth in spending for Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, above all else, driven by both the aging of the population, by an expansion of health insurance subsidies, and by rising costs of health care per person.
Thank you. Mr. Van Hollen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick comment on the Fed. As the Federal Reserve pointed out, the fact that Congress created a fiscal drag on the economy made things worse, and the Fed did take some accommodating actions. But their message to Congress was, sequester is doing harm, it's hurting economic growth, it's hurting job growth, and it continues to do so to this day, this refusal to take action on investments in infrastructure and in basic the foundations of our national economy in many areas. There's been a lot of talk about the report and what you've said about the Affordable Care Act. I just want to go through a couple things. You found, did you not, that the premiums offered in the exchange would actually be going down 15% compared to your earlier projection. Is that right?
Yes, for 2014.
Thank you. And on page 125, you point out that there's, quote, no compelling evidence that part-time employment has increased as a result of the Affordable Care Act. Is that right?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
Thank you. And because we've heard a lot of statements about how people are being forced into part-time work by the Affordable Care Act. I want to make it clear, one of the findings of CBO is there's no compelling evidence that that's the case. Second, there's nothing in this report that changes CBO's earlier assessment that over the 10-year window and, in fact, over the longer-term window, the net effects of the Affordable Care Act is actually to reduce our national deficits. Isn't that right?
That's right, Congressman.
All right. And doesn't reducing our national deficits, especially as the economy kicks into higher gear, mean stronger economic growth?
Yes, Congressman.
All right. So as a result of the deficit reduction impact of the Affordable Care Act, in 2017 and beyond, the Affordable Care Act will actually help spur economic growth. Now, I want to talk about what we're doing, focusing right now, because on page 125, the CBO talks about the impact on the labor market, on labor demand today. And it says, and I quote, on balance, the CBO estimates that the ACA will boost overall demand for goods and services over the next few years. And then you go on to say the net increase in demand for goods and services will in turn boost demand for labor over the next few years. That's a conclusion you make, right?
Yes, that's right.
So when you boost demand for labor in this kind of economy, you actually reduce the unemployment rate because those people who are looking for work can find more work, right?
Yes, that's right.
So I just, for all the media who, shot across the headlines this idea that somehow the Affordable Care Act was going to hurt jobs, I just want it to be very clear that the director of the Congressional Budget Office says for this year and the next couple of years, actually it will help reduce unemployment. More people who are looking for work will find work as a result of the Affordable Care Act. So in fact, Dr. Elmendorf, if you were to repeal the Affordable Care Act, your projected unemployment rate for this year would go up, right?
Well, so Mr. Congressman, let me be clear that so we've not broken down the sizes of the various pieces that we talk about in this act. So I don't have any estimates of the effects of the particular channel you point to. But that channel you point to is in fact something that we think spurs employment and would reduce unemployment over the next few years.
Right. Okay. So I think it is a factor, and as a result, if you repeal the Affordable Care Act, you will, at least in the near term, increase the unemployment rate because there will be less demand for jobs. And over the longer term, because the Affordable Care Act reduces the deficit, you will actually spur economic growth as the economy continues to recover. Now, I think it's really important that that information gets out there because as the media themselves have confessed, they bought hook, line, and sinker some of the talking points from our Republican colleagues, and unfortunately misrepresentations go around the world 3 times before the truth begins to catch up, but maybe it will begin to catch up at this point. Now, in terms of the long-term deficits and debt, as the chairman indicated, as your report indicates, as you go out into the future, we will see rising deficits. It is important to point out that your findings show that right now our deficits are dropping and will continue to drop for the next couple of years. But as more baby boomers retire and there are more people on Medicare and Social Security, spending will slowly go up. Isn't that right, Doctor?
That's right. There'll be more than 1/3 more people collecting Social Security and Medicare benefits a decade from now than are doing so today. Whatever the benefit is per person, multiply that amount by a much larger number of people. The overall cost of those programs will rise very sharply.
That's right. So I mean, we're talking tens of millions of people. I believe it's in the range of additional 30+ million more people on Medicare. And just so people who are following this understand, this is not because we're increasing the Medicare benefits. This is just more people coming into the system. This is a demographic change. Is that right, Dr. Elmendorf?
Yes, that's right.
And so that's a big driver. Now, our Republican colleagues say that those deficits concern them. However, they're only willing to look at the spending side of the equation, meaning if you want to address those spending problems, it means you've got to reduce the benefits from Social Security or Medicare somehow, if we're looking at those 2 pieces, right, Dr. Elmendorf?
Yes, unless one is willing to contract the rest of the government to below where it was as a share of the economy in 1940, then one needs to focus on this handful of large programs that are getting more expensive if one wants to cut spending. And
as you pointed out in this report, and it's been very clear, we have squeezed those so-called discretionary spending programs to the lowest point in recorded budget history. Is that right?
We'll have a few years from now after the current caps have unfolded.
So our Republican colleagues' solution is simply to look at squeezing those benefits, which help millions of Americans, including a lot of middle-income, struggling seniors. And they've refused to look at the revenue side of the equation. It is their position that you cannot close a single tax loophole for the purpose of reducing the deficit, right? That's the Grover Norquist pledge. You can't close one loophole in the taxes for the oil and gas company or hedge funds in order to help reduce the deficit. And my question, Dr. Elmendorf, is if you go back a little ways in history, when's the last time we actually had a balanced budget?
I think 2000 or 2001, Congressman.
2001. And in fact, the last time we had a balanced budget for a very long period of time were the years 1998, 1999, 2000, 2001. Is that right?
Yes, that's right.
And just so everyone understands, for decades before that, we were running deficits, and obviously since 2001 we've run deficits. Now, Dr. Elmendorf, if you look at the revenues as a percent of GDP during that period of time, they are higher in each of those years than they are today. Is that right?
Yes, that's right, Congressman.
And they're higher, are they not, in each of those years than they will be as a percent of the economy 10 years from now.
Yes, that's right.
In fact, you know, my calculation is that the average amount of revenue as percent of GDP, when we last balanced the budget, was 19% of GDP. During those 4 years, the average amount of revenue coming in was 19% of GDP. Now, you have just testified that the main reason that we're going to see an increase in the deficit in the out years is because we have tens of millions more Americans on programs like Social Security and Medicare, right?
Yes.
All right. So it's our Republican colleagues' position that we can somehow deal with that huge increase in the number of Americans on Social Security and Medicare with less revenue as a percent of GDP than we had when we last balanced the budget in 1998 to 2001, when we had a lot fewer Americans on Social Security and Medicare. And that is the problem, Mr. Chairman, a lot of our Democratic colleagues have. You take the position that you won't close a single tax break for the purpose of reducing the deficit. You say you care a lot about the deficit. You recognize that you've got tens of millions more Americans on Social Security and Medicare, but you still want the government to operate on less revenue as a percent of GDP than the last time we had a balanced budget when we didn't have all those tens of millions of Americans on Social Security and Medicare. So the only solution that our Republican colleagues are proposing, unless they want to cut even more deeply into our investments in defense and scientific research and infrastructure, is to simply cut those other programs. And the irony here is the Affordable Care Act actually was able to reduce the Medicare spending by reforming it instead of cutting it. We, as a result of the Affordable Care Act, Dr. Elmendorf, we are seeing reduced Medicare costs. Isn't that the case?
Yes, that's right.
In fact, that's a significant part of the reduction in the deficit over a period of time. Is that right?
Yes.
Yeah. And in fact, our Republican colleagues, after initially, lambasting that and demagoguing that, they included that provision in their own budget so they would achieve those deficit savings. So we were actually able to achieve Medicare savings without hurting beneficiaries. And that is the model that we will continue to look at, and combined with closing tax breaks for special interests in order to meet these long-term challenges. But our immediate challenge is to put people back to work, and that's why we need to adopt our infrastructure investment plan, pass the minimum wage, and for the folks who are still out there hurting, we should extend emergency unemployment insurance, and we certainly, Mr. Chairman, should not mess around with whether or not we pay our bills on time. Thank you very much.
Dr. Price. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Elmendorf, welcome to the committee once again. Appreciate the good work that CBO has done, and I think there are, my friend from Maryland says the report is good news and bad news, and I would agree with that. The problem is that when you compare it to last year's report and reports prior to that, there's more bad news this year than there was last year, and less good news this year. Our friend makes the comment about decreasing Medicare spending. Yeah, the spending in Medicare has decreased by $700 billion because of the Affordable Care Act, but it's forced reductions. And as a physician, I can tell you that my former medical colleagues will say that it actually is harming health care for seniors. And so the challenge that we have here is to put in place programs that don't harm seniors, and our friends on the other side seem to be willing to put in place programs that actually do harm seniors. Mr. Elmendorf, Dr. Elmendorf, what happens in a fiscal crisis to those benefits for seniors?
Well, it depends the nature of the crisis and what the Congress does to respond to it. But the fiscal crisis, as we've used the term, as a point at which investors are unwilling to buy U.S. government debt unless it carries very high interest rates. And that then puts a tremendous squeeze on the market.
On this vote, the yeas are 226 and the nays are 196. The previous question is ordered. The question is on adoption of the resolution. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it.
Mr. Speaker, on that I ask for a recorded vote.
A recorded vote is requested. Those favoring a recorded vote will rise. A sufficient number having risen, a recorded vote is ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 5-minute vote.